The Galactic Military Academy's grand auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as cadets from across the known systems filed into their assigned seats. Representatives from the Zephyrian Empire sat in their pristine blue uniforms, their tall, graceful forms radiating the confidence of a species that had never lost a ground war. The Korvaxi delegation clustered together, their four arms gesturing rapidly as they discussed tactical scenarios in their clicking language. Even the mysterious Veiltar had sent observers, their shadowy forms barely visible in the dim alcoves they preferred. At the center of it all, looking almost insignificant in his simple green uniform, sat Cadet Marcus Chen of Earth. He was the first human ever admitted to the Academy, a gesture that many species considered either remarkably progressive or dangerously naive. Humans had only made contact with the galactic community 3 years ago, and their planet was still considered a backwater world on the edge of civilized space. "Welcome, cadets, to your final examination," announced Grand Admiral Thexivor, his tentacles writhing with barely contained excitement. The ancient cephaloid had overseen these examinations for over 2 centuries, and his reputation for asking impossible questions was legendary throughout the galaxy. "Today, we will test not your knowledge of textbook tactics, but your ability to think like true military strategists." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the past year, he had struggled to keep up with his classmates. While they effortlessly calculated hyperspace jump coordinates and memorized the specifications of 17 different plasma cannon types, he found himself thinking about mud, rain, and the kind of warfare that happened when technology failed and soldiers had to rely on nothing but their training and determination. "Our scenario today," the Grand Admiral continued, his voice echoing through the vast chamber, "involves the conquest of a strategically vital world. The planet Carenis Prime sits at the junction of 3 major hyperspace routes, making it perhaps the most important military position in this sector of the galaxy." A holographic display materialized above the assembly, showing a blue-green world surrounded by defensive satellites and patrol fleets. Marcus leaned forward, studying the terrain maps that appeared alongside the orbital view. Dense forests covered most of the northern continent, while vast urban centers sprawled across the southern land masses. The defenders possess a full orbital defense grid, planetary shield generators, and an army of 50 million highly trained soldiers equipped with the latest in military technology. They have prepared for siege warfare and can maintain their position for approximately 10 standard years without outside support. A murmur ran through the assembled cadets. This was not the kind of problem that could be solved with a simple flanking maneuver or surprise attack. The Zephyrian cadets were already inputting calculations into their tactical computers, while the Korvaxi had begun sketching out complex battle formations on their datapads. "Your task," Grand Admiral Thexivor announced, "is to devise a strategy for conquering this world using a force of exactly 100,000 soldiers. You may equip them with any technology currently available to galactic military forces, but you may not exceed this number. You have 1 hour to present your solutions." The auditorium erupted into focused activity. Team leaders emerged naturally from each species delegation, organizing their fellow cadets into working groups. The Zephyrians immediately began calculating orbital bombardment patterns, seeking to overwhelm the planetary shields through concentrated firepower. The Korvaxi focused on siege warfare, designing massive mechanical constructs that could breach the strongest fortifications. Marcus sat alone, ignored by the other cadets, who had long ago given up trying to include the strange human in their planning sessions. He stared at the holographic display, but his mind wandered to stories his grandfather had told him about ancient Earth conflicts, wars fought in jungles and mountains, where superior technology meant nothing if you couldn't find your enemy. As the hour progressed, elaborate presentations began to take shape around the auditorium. The Zephyrians had developed a plan involving orbital mirrors that would focus stellar energy into concentrated beams, slowly wearing down the planetary shields over several months. The Korvaxi proposed tunneling machines that would burrow beneath the planet's crust, emerging inside the shield perimeter to establish forward bases. Other species offered variations on these themes. The crystalline Shardkai suggested using their natural ability to survive in space to conduct boarding actions against the orbital platforms. The aquatic depth moors designed specialized atmospheric processors that would gradually alter the planet's air composition, making it uninhabitable for the defenders. Each plan was technically brilliant, showcasing the unique advantages and technologies of its creators. The Zephyrians' orbital bombardment would indeed eventually breach any shield. The Korvaxi tunneling operation could theoretically succeed, given enough time and resources. Even the more exotic approaches had merit in the right circumstances. But Marcus noticed something that none of the other cadets seemed to consider. Every plan they developed assumed that warfare was primarily about technology and firepower. They calculated shield strengths and armor thicknesses, orbital mechanics and energy outputs, but they never asked the most important question of all. Who were they fighting, and why were they fighting so hard? As the presentations began, Marcus watched his classmates display their elaborate schemes to the examining panel. Grand Admiral Thexvor listened politely to each proposal, occasionally asking technical questions about power requirements or logistical challenges. The other examining officers, representatives from the galaxy's major military powers, took careful notes and whispered among themselves. An impressive array of solutions, the Grand Admiral finally announced when the last presentation concluded. Each of you has demonstrated mastery of advanced military theory and tactical thinking. However, I noticed that one cadet has not yet shared his proposal. All eyes turned to Marcus, who realized with growing horror that he was being called upon to speak. Around the auditorium, his classmates exchanged knowing glances. The human would undoubtedly embarrass himself with some primitive approach involving ground troops and conventional weapons. Cadet Chen, Grand Admiral Thexvor's voice carried a note of curiosity. Perhaps you would share your thoughts on this tactical challenge? Marcus stood slowly, his heart pounding. He had no elaborate presentation, no carefully calculated technical specifications. All he had were the stories his grandfather had told him and a growing certainty that everyone else was missing something fundamental. Thank you, sir, he began, his voice barely carrying across the vast chamber. I've listened to all the presentations and they're all very impressive from a technical standpoint, but I think we're asking the wrong question. A ripple of whispered comments ran through the assembled cadets. The examining officers leaned forward with interest. The question isn't how to defeat 50 million soldiers with advanced technology, Marcus continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. The question is why those 50 million soldiers are willing to die for this planet in the first place. Elaborate, Grand Admiral Thexvor commanded, his tentacles now perfectly still. Every plan we've heard today assumes that this is purely a military problem, Marcus said. But no army fights that hard just because they're ordered to. Those soldiers are defending something they care about, their homes, their families, their way of life, and that means they're not just soldiers anymore. They're civilians who happen to be armed. The Zephyrian team leader, a tall female named Silandra, stood to object. Cadet Chen, with respect, you're ignoring the fundamental realities of modern warfare. Motivation cannot overcome technological superiority. Can't it? Marcus turned to face her directly. How many wars has your empire won against determined defenders fighting on their home ground? Silandra opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The uncomfortable truth was that the Zephyrian Empire, for all its technological prowess, had struggled for decades with insurgencies on conquered worlds. Their advanced weapons were less effective against enemies who knew every cave and forest path, who could strike from hiding and disappear before orbital bombardment could respond. "You're suggesting that superior technology is irrelevant?" asked Commander Vexhai of the Korvaxi delegation, his four arms crossing skeptically. "Not irrelevant," Marcus replied, "but not decisive either. Not when your enemy doesn't fight the way you expect them to." He moved closer to the holographic display, pointing to the dense forests covering the northern continent. "Look at this terrain. Those aren't just trees. That's concealment for millions of potential fighters. Every civilian who knows those woods becomes a threat that your orbital sensors can't track." "But surely," interrupted a Shardkai observer, her crystalline voice tinkling like wind chimes, "any resistance movement would collapse once their leadership was eliminated?" Marcus shook his head. "That assumes they're organized like a traditional military force." "But what if they're not? What if every factory worker, every teacher, every parent becomes a soldier when needed? How do you eliminate the leadership of an entire population?" The auditorium had grown completely silent now. Even the examining officers were listening intently as this young human challenged every assumption about modern warfare. "So what do you propose?" Grand Admiral Thexavor asked. "How would you accomplish the mission with your 100,000 soldiers?" Marcus took a deep breath. This was the moment that would either validate his thinking or end his military career before it began. "I wouldn't use them as soldiers," he said simply. "I'd use them as teachers." The word teachers hung in the air like a challenge to everything the galactic military establishment believed about warfare. Several cadets began whispering frantically to their teammates, certain they had misheard the human's proposal. Grand Admiral Thexavor's tentacles twitched in what those familiar with cephaloid expressions recognized as deep confusion. "Teachers?" Commander Vexhai of the Korvaxi finally spoke, his four arms gesturing in what could only be interpreted as bewilderment. "Cadet Chen, this is a military academy, not an educational institution. We are discussing the conquest of a heavily defended world, not the establishment of a school system." Marcus nodded calmly, seemingly unaffected by the skeptical stares directed his way. "Yes, sir, I understand. But conquest doesn't have to mean destruction. And sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a plasma cannon or an orbital bombardment platform." He gestured toward the holographic display showing Carenis Prime. "Look at this world again. 50 million defenders, willing to fight for 10 years against impossible odds. That level of dedication doesn't come from military discipline alone. It comes from believing that they're protecting something precious and irreplaceable." Silandra of the Zephyrians stood again, her elegant features twisted in frustration. "Cadet Chen, you're being deliberately obtuse. The scenario clearly states that we must conquer this world. Not negotiate with it, not establish diplomatic relations, but conquer it militarily." "I'm not suggesting diplomacy," Marcus replied. "I'm suggesting something much more radical. I'm suggesting we make them want to surrender." The examining officers exchanged glances. Professor Keth Marin, the Academy's leading expert on xenopsychology, leaned forward with obvious interest. As a member of the peaceful but highly analytical Telvanni species, he had spent his career studying the motivations that drove different civilizations to war. "Continue, Cadet Chen," Grand Admiral Thexavor commanded. "Explain how teachers accomplish what armies cannot." Marcus moved to stand directly beneath the holographic planet, its blue-green glow casting shadows across his face. "The defenders of Carenis Prime are fighting because they believe their way of life is threatened. They think we want to destroy everything they've built and replace it with something alien and hostile. But what if we proved them wrong?" He pointed to the urban centers scattered across the southern continent. "Those cities represent centuries of development, millions of lives built around specific cultural values and social structures. Our standard conquest doctrine would involve occupying those cities, imposing our governmental systems, and forcing the population to adapt to our requirements. Which is precisely what conquest means, interrupted a Veiltar observer, speaking from the shadows in a voice like rustling leaves. The subjugation of one civilization by another. But why? Marcus asked, turning to face the shadowy alcove where the Veiltar delegation sat. Why do we need to subjugate them? The scenario states that Carenis Prime is strategically vital because of its position at the junction of 3 hyperspace routes. It doesn't say anything about needing to control the population or extract resources from the planet itself. Professor Kethmaran's antennae began vibrating rapidly, a sign of intense intellectual excitement among his species. You're suggesting that we separate the strategic objective from the cultural conquest. Exactly, Marcus said, grateful that someone finally understood his direction. We don't need to control Carenis Prime. We just need to ensure that it doesn't fall under hostile control. And the best way to do that is to make the population genuinely happy to be part of our alliance. The auditorium erupted in discussion as cadets from various species began arguing among themselves about the feasibility of such an approach. The Korvaxi delegation was particularly vocal in their objections, their clicking language rising to an almost musical crescendo as they debated the tactical implications. Order! Grand Admiral Thexavor's voice boomed across the chamber, his tentacles now glowing with bioluminescent authority patterns. Cadet Chen, please explain the specific role of these 100,000 teachers in accomplishing this objective. Marcus took a moment to organize his thoughts. He knew he was proposing something that went against thousands of years of galactic military doctrine, and he needed to be absolutely clear about his reasoning. The 100,000 personnel would not be teachers in the traditional sense, he began. They would be specialists in what humans call hearts and minds operations, engineers who help improve planetary infrastructure, medical personnel who provide advanced healthcare to the civilian population, agricultural experts who increase crop yields and reduce famine, cultural advisors who help preserve and strengthen local traditions while introducing beneficial outside innovations. Silandra's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching horror. You're describing an invasion force that makes the target population better off than they were before. That's not conquest. That's how you win a war without firing a shot, Marcus finished. Within 6 months, the planetary leadership would be facing a population that sees our presence as beneficial rather than threatening. The defensive motivation that currently drives their military preparations would evaporate. Commander Vexhi's 4 arms were now gesticulating in complex patterns that indicated deep thought among his species. But Cadet Chen, this approach assumes that the defending population is rational and can be persuaded. What if their resistance is based on religious or ideological factors that cannot be overcome through material improvements? Marcus nodded appreciatively. That's exactly why cultural advisors would be so important. Every species, every civilization has core values that define their identity. Our job wouldn't be to change those values, but to demonstrate that our presence supports rather than threatens them. He gestured toward the various alien delegations around the auditorium. The Zephyrians value artistic expression and intellectual achievement. The Korvaxi prize engineering excellence and structural harmony. The Shardkai celebrate individual crystalline uniqueness within collective consciousness. Every species here has fundamental drives that could be strengthened rather than suppressed by wise governance. Professor Kethmaran was now taking rapid notes on his personal device, his antennae quivering with excitement. This approach would require unprecedented intelligence gathering about the target population, not military intelligence, but cultural, social, and psychological understanding. Which is why it would work, Marcus said confidently. Traditional military intelligence focuses on defensive capabilities, troop movements, and weapon systems. But this approach would require us to understand what the population actually wants and needs, and once we understand that, providing it becomes a matter of logistics rather than tactics. A new voice entered the debate from an unexpected source. One of the examining officers, Admiral Sarthex of the notoriously aggressive Predator caste, had remained silent throughout the discussion. Now he leaned forward, his scaled features reflecting genuine curiosity. Cadet Chen, your proposal is intriguing, but it assumes that our own forces would be willing to participate in such an operation. Many military personnel join the service specifically for the opportunity to engage in traditional combat. How would you maintain discipline and morale among troops who might view this mission as beneath their warrior status? Marcus had been dreading this question, but he also knew it was crucial to address. With respect, Admiral, that attitude is exactly why traditional conquest operations often fail in the long term. Soldiers who see the civilian population as enemies will always face resistance, but soldiers who see themselves as protectors and builders become heroes to the people they serve. He paused, thinking of his grandfather's stories about peacekeeping missions and reconstruction efforts. On Earth, our most successful military operations have been those where soldiers felt they were making life better for innocent people. When you're building schools instead of destroying them, when you're bringing medical supplies instead of calling in airstrikes, you don't have to worry about insurgency because you've eliminated the motivation for resistance. The Veiltar observer spoke again from the shadows, their voice carrying a note of what might have been approval. This human speaks of warfare as a tool for creation rather than destruction. Such thinking is unexpected. It's more than unexpected, said Grand Admiral Thexvor, his tentacles now completely still as he processed the implications of Marcus's proposal. It's revolutionary. If this approach could be made to work, it would fundamentally change how we think about military objectives throughout the galaxy. Marcus felt a surge of hope, but he also knew that the most difficult questions were yet to come. Around the auditorium, his fellow cadets were beginning to grasp the scope of what he was proposing. This wasn't just a different tactical approach to a single scenario. This was a complete reimagining of what conquest meant in an age of galactic civilization. However, the Grand Admiral continued, and Marcus's heart sank at the ominous tone, there remains the question of implementation. Cadet Chen, you have described an idealistic scenario in which everything proceeds according to plan. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when the population refuses to be won over, when cultural differences prove insurmountable, when traditional military action becomes necessary? This was the moment Marcus had been preparing for since he first conceived his answer, the moment when idealism had to meet the harsh realities of military necessity. Then we adapt, he said simply, but we adapt from a position of moral authority that traditional conquest never provides. Admiral Sarthex leaned back in his chair, his predatory features displaying something that might have been respect. Moral authority is a luxury that commanders cannot always afford, Cadet Chen. When civilians are dying and strategic objectives must be achieved, philosophy becomes secondary to results. Marcus met the Admiral's gaze steadily. With respect, sir, I disagree. Moral authority isn't a luxury in warfare. It's the most powerful weapon any military force can possess, and it's particularly powerful when your enemy expects you to act without it. He turned to address the entire assembly, his voice carrying across the vast auditorium with growing confidence. Think about the scenario we've been given. Carenus Prime's defenders are prepared to fight for 10 years against overwhelming odds. That's not normal military behavior. That's the behavior of people who believe they're facing extinction. Professor Keth Moran's antennae were now vibrating so rapidly they were almost humming. You're suggesting that their defensive preparations are based on assumptions about our intentions rather than our capabilities. Exactly, Marcus said, grateful for the support. They've studied our previous conquest operations. They've seen worlds bombarded from orbit, populations relocated, cultural institutions dismantled. They believe that's what we do because that's what we've always done. Silandra of the Zephyrians spoke slowly, her elegant features creased in concentration. But if we approached them differently, if we demonstrated that our intentions were genuinely benevolent, their motivation to resist would be undermined. More than undermined, Marcus replied. It would be reversed. Instead of 50 million desperate defenders, we would eventually have 50 million grateful allies. And allies are worth more than conquered populations because allies fight for you instead of against you. Commander Vexhi's 4 arms had stilled into a pattern that indicated deep philosophical contemplation among his species. This approach would require patience on a scale that most military commanders find unacceptable. Traditional conquest operations produce immediate, measurable results. How do you convince a general to choose a strategy that might take years to fully succeed? Marcus had been thinking about this problem throughout his time at the Academy. You demonstrate that the long-term benefits outweigh the short-term costs. A traditionally conquered world requires constant military occupation to prevent rebellion. The resources devoted to suppressing resistance could instead be used for expansion into new territories or development of existing holdings. The Veiltar observer stirred in the shadows, their voice carrying notes of genuine curiosity. You speak of efficiency in terms that transcend simple military calculations. This suggests a philosophical approach to warfare that my people would find intriguing. Grand Admiral Thexivor had remained silent during this exchange, his tentacles displaying the complex patterns that indicated intense mental processing among cephaloids. Now he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of military experience. Cadet Chen, your proposal raises questions that extend far beyond this examination scenario. You are suggesting that we abandon conquest doctrines that have served the galactic community for thousands of years. The implications are staggering. Marcus felt the weight of every gaze in the auditorium focused upon him. This was no longer just an academic exercise. The examining officers were treating his proposal as a serious strategic doctrine that could reshape galactic military policy. Sir, he said carefully, I'm not suggesting we abandon our ability to use traditional military force when necessary. I'm suggesting we save it for situations where it's actually needed instead of using it as our default approach to every problem. Admiral Sarthex growled low in his throat, a sound that would have terrified most species. And how do you determine when traditional force is necessary, Cadet? Military history is filled with commanders who hesitated to act decisively and paid for that hesitation with defeat. You determine it by asking the right questions, Marcus replied. Are we facing an enemy that threatens galactic stability, or are we facing people who just want to be left alone? Are we fighting to prevent genuine atrocities, or are we fighting to expand our territory? Are we responding to aggression, or are we the aggressors? The auditorium had grown completely silent. Even the ever-present hum of the life support system seemed muted as everyone absorbed the implications of what the young human was saying. Professor Keth Moran spoke into the silence, his voice trembling with excitement. This represents a fundamental shift from conquest-based expansion to alliance-based integration. Instead of forcing worlds to submit to galactic civilization, we invite them to join it willingly. But what about worlds that refuse the invitation? Asked a Shardkai cadet, her crystalline voice ringing with harmonic overtones. What about civilizations that are genuinely hostile to everything we represent? Marcus nodded appreciatively. Those are exactly the situations where traditional military force becomes necessary. But here's the crucial difference. When you've exhausted every peaceful option, when you've genuinely tried to find common ground and failed, then you can use force with the moral authority that comes from knowing you had no other choice. He gestured toward the holographic display of Karanis Prime. In this scenario, we don't know why the defenders are so determined to resist. Traditional doctrine assumes they're naturally hostile and must be crushed. But what if they're terrified? What if they've been told that surrender means death or slavery? Our first obligation should be to find out what they actually believe and why. Grand Admiral Thexvor's tentacles had begun to glow with patterns that indicated not just mental processing, but what cephaloids called paradigm integration, the moment when a fundamentally new concept becomes part of their worldview. The strategic implications are remarkable, he said slowly. An alliance-based expansion model would create geometric growth in our influence. Each world that joins willingly becomes a platform for approaching the next world with credible evidence of our benevolent intentions. And the intelligence advantages would be unprecedented, added Commander Vex High, his military mind immediately grasping the practical benefits. Willing allies provide information about potential threats, trade routes, resource locations, and political situations throughout their regions of space. Silandra was now staring at Marcus with something approaching awe. You're describing a form of conquest that makes itself stronger by making others stronger. Instead of draining conquered worlds to fuel further expansion, we would be creating partners who contribute to our collective capabilities. Marcus felt a surge of excitement as he realized that these brilliant minds were not only understanding his proposal, but expanding upon it in ways he hadn't fully considered. And the cultural benefits would be immeasurable. Every willing ally brings their own knowledge, their own perspectives, their own innovations to the galactic community. The Veiltar observer spoke again, their shadowy form seeming to lean forward with interest. This human describes conquest not as the subjugation of the weak by the strong, but as the integration of diverse strengths into collective power. Admiral Sarthex had been silent for several minutes, his predatory features locked in concentration. Now he spoke, and his words stunned everyone in the auditorium. I have spent 40 years believing that strength comes from the ability to destroy one's enemies, he said slowly. This cadet suggests that true strength comes from the ability to transform enemies into allies. And the more I consider this proposition, the more I realize that he may be correct. Grand Admiral Thexvor rose from his chair, his ancient form radiating an authority that commanded immediate attention from every being in the vast chamber. Cadet Chen, he said formally, in 3 centuries of examining military cadets from across the galaxy, I have never heard a proposal that so completely challenged my fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare. Your answer to our scenario has left this academy with far more questions than we began with. Marcus felt his heart pounding as he waited for the Admiral's verdict. Around him, his fellow cadets sat in absolute silence, aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the Academy's long history. However, the Grand Admiral continued, questions are often more valuable than answers. The questions you have raised today will reshape how we think about military strategy for generations to come. Your proposal demonstrates not just tactical innovation, but strategic wisdom. The Admiral's tentacles began displaying the formal patterns that accompanied official announcements. The examining board has reached a unanimous decision. Cadet Chen, you will graduate with highest honors and with our strongest recommendation for immediate assignment to the Galactic Strategic Planning Division. The auditorium erupted in cheers and applause from every species present. Even the Veiltar, normally silent observers, rustled their approval from the shadows. But Grand Admiral Thexvor raised a tentacle for continued attention. More importantly, he announced, this academy will immediately begin development of new courses in alliance-based strategic doctrine. What we have heard today represents not just a successful examination answer, but the foundation of a new approach to galactic military policy. As the celebration continued around him, Marcus stood quietly beneath the holographic image of Carenis Prime. In his mind, he could see a future where that beautiful blue-green world joined the galactic community not as a conquered territory, but as a willing partner. A future where strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to build. His grandfather would have been proud. The old Marine had always said that the best victory was the one where nobody had to die. Today, Marcus had proven that even in the vast complexity of galactic warfare, that simple truth still applied. The Academy would never be the same, and neither would the galaxy.